The town of Bramblewick was the sort of place people imagined when they thought of peace. Its cobbled streets wound gently between tidy cottages, each with ivy climbing their stone walls. Children rode bicycles along the narrow lanes. Shopkeepers leaned out of their doorways to greet neighbors by name, and the bell tower above St. Mary's chimed every hour in a steady, reassuring rhythm. But no sound was more familiar to the people of Bramblewick than the ticking of Mr. Hatherley's clocks. The clockmaker's shop, Hatherley's Clockworks, stood at the corner of Market Street, its windows filled with gleaming brass pendulums and finely painted clock faces. Inside, every inch of the shop was alive with the gentle tick-tock of dozens of timepieces, from tiny pocket watches to towering grandfather clocks that stretched nearly to the ceiling. And high above them all, in a snug apartment with a single dormer window, lived the clockmaker himself, Mr. Alfred Hatherley. A quiet man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, he rarely left the shop. Some said he hardly left his workbench at all. He had lived in Bramblewick for as long as anyone could remember, repairing watches, crafting new clocks, and keeping the town's bell tower tuned so precisely that the chimes rang within seconds of his shop's timepieces. To the townsfolk, he was simply the keeper of time. The morning of silence on an autumn morning, the people of Bramblewick noticed something unusual. The shop door stood ajar, its bell silent. Inside, the counters were undisturbed, but there was no sign of Mr. Hatherley. More unsettling still, every clock in the shop had stopped. The pendulums hung motionless. The watches sat in eerie stillness. The air, normally alive with hundreds of ticking beats, was heavy with silence. All except for one clock. The clock at 11:11. On the center counter sat a large brass clock, its hands frozen at precisely 11:11. Its tick-tock was faint, irregular, as though it were struggling to keep going. The townsfolk whispered about omens and secrets, but young Thomas, the apprentice who had worked beside Hatherley for nearly 2 years, noticed something no one else did. Beside the brass clock lay an envelope, addressed in the clockmaker's careful handwriting. For Thomas. Thomas opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink fresh, the letters deliberate. It read, "When the clocks stop, follow the sound only you can hear." Thomas frowned. The words made little sense. And yet, as he stood in the silent shop, he felt a faint vibration, a distant ticking that seemed to echo from somewhere above his head. The sound wasn't coming from the counter. It wasn't coming from the shelves. It was coming from the attic. Thomas stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase that led to the attic. It was a staircase he had never climbed, for Mr. Hatherley had always kept the door locked and dismissed any questions about what lay above. Now the door hung slightly ajar, and from within came that faint, steady ticking. It was not loud, in fact. It seemed so delicate that Thomas wondered whether he was the only one who could hear it at all. The ascent, the stairs creaked under his weight. Dust motes floated in the pale light streaming from the dormer window. With each step, the ticking grew clearer, though still strangely out of rhythm, like a heartbeat too fast to match the steady calm of a clock. When he reached the top, Thomas paused, his hand on the latch of the attic door. He half expected to find his master waiting within, but when he pushed it open, the attic lay still. The attic room, the space was cluttered with boxes, trunks, and the long-forgotten furniture of a lifetime. Cobwebs stretched from rafter to rafter. And yet there was order too. Against the far wall stood a wooden trunk, with brass fittings that gleamed despite the dust. On its surface, carved into the wood itself, was a small compass rose. And from within that trunk came the ticking. The trunk and its contents. Thomas knelt and pressed his ear against the lid. Yes, the sound was unmistakable. But when he unlatched the trunk and lifted it open, there was no clock inside. Instead, it contained journals. Dozens of them, their leather covers worn, each filled with the neat, precise handwriting of Alfred Hatherley. Beside the journals were folded sketches of strange mechanisms, clocks with multiple pendulums, devices that looked part clock, part compass, and even blueprints for something resembling a great wheel of gears. At the bottom of the trunk, beneath the journals, was a rolled parchment tied with string. Thomas untied it and spread it across the floor. The map, it was a map of Bramblewick, but not as Thomas had ever seen it. The streets were carefully drawn, the landmarks labeled in Hatherley's hand. And yet certain locations were marked with bold red ink. The old library at the north end of town, the baker's cellar on Mill Lane, the town hall, and St. Mary's bell tower. Beside each red mark was a tiny symbol of a gear. The mystery deepens. Thomas traced the marks with his finger. Why these places? What tied them together? And what did it mean when his master had written in the corner of the map, "Time hides all truths"? The ticking suddenly faded. Thomas looked back into the trunk. The journals were still. The attic was silent again. The map in Thomas's hands felt heavier than paper. It was as though the ink itself carried a secret weight. And of all the marked places, the old library on the north end of Bramblewick stood out as the most curious. It was not only the oldest building in town, but also the quietest. Few visited its musty shelves anymore, and fewer still remembered that it had once been a meeting hall, before it was converted to house books. If there was a place to hide secrets, the library was perfect. Arrival at the library, the librarian, Mrs. Greenway, was a kindly woman who had known Thomas since he was a boy. When he asked if he might look through the library's upper shelves, she smiled and waved him on. Mrs. Greenway, "Careful up there, Thomas. Those beams creak more than my knees." He carried the map folded in his pocket, his heart beating faster as he climbed the narrow ladder toward the highest rows of books. The clue behind the shelves. The map had marked the north wall. Thomas ran his fingers along the spines of books, then tapped lightly against the wood behind them. Hollow. He pressed harder. One section of shelving shifted, the faint grind of stone echoing behind it. With effort, he pulled the shelf outward. A narrow gap appeared, just wide enough for him to slip inside. The passage revealed. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp stone. A narrow staircase descended behind the shelf, spiraling downward into darkness. Thomas lit the small lantern he had borrowed from the shop, its glow casting shadows that danced along the walls. Each step echoed. Each echo reminded him that this place had not been touched for years. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a small chamber. The hidden chamber, it was round, with a vaulted ceiling, and in the center stood a strange contraption, a wooden frame holding gears and pendulums that looked like the skeleton of a massive clock. But this was no ordinary timepiece. Its gears were mismatched, its pendulum incomplete, as though someone had begun to build a machine but never finished it. On the wall opposite, scratched deeply into the stone, were 4 words: "Time hides all truths." The missing pieces. Thomas leaned closer. The machine's design seemed familiar, a version of sketches he had seen in Hatherley's journals. But this one was larger, designed not to tell time, but perhaps to measure something else entirely. Yet parts of it were missing. Gaps where gears should have been, spaces where rods had once fit. Someone had taken pieces away. The map's second red mark lay on Mill Lane, beneath the town's busiest bakery. By day, the place was filled with the scent of warm bread, freshly baked rolls, and the cheerful laughter of families. But below the stone floor of that little shop, Thomas and Inspector Clarke would uncover a secret that had nothing to do with flour or ovens. Meeting the baker, Mr. Hobbs, was a stout man with flour, perpetually dusting his apron. He had known Thomas since childhood and greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Hobbs, come for a loaf, lad? You're in luck. Just pulled a batch from the oven." Thomas smiled politely, but his attention was fixed on the trapdoor at the back of the shop. The map showed the cellar marked with a red deer. Clarke, ever the polite investigator, leaned on the counter. "Clarke, we were hoping to take a quick look in your cellar, Mr. Hobbs. We believe something of Mr. Hatherley's may have been stored there." The baker frowned at first, but curiosity won out over hesitation. "Mr. Hobbs, strangest request I've had all week. But go on then. Mind the barrels." The descent, the trapdoor creaked as Clarke pulled it open. A steep wooden ladder descended into the cool, damp cellar below. Thomas climbed down first, lantern in hand. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and earth. Rows of shelves held flour sacks and baskets of grain. But one corner was different. The stone wall there was smooth, as though plaster had been applied more recently. And faintly, just faintly, Thomas thought he heard it again. The ticking. The hidden door. Clarke ran his hand along the plaster. There, almost invisible, was the outline of a narrow doorway. He pressed his shoulder against it. The plaster crumbled, revealing a wooden panel set into the stone. With effort, they pried it open. Beyond it lay a passage, low, narrow, and lined with wooden beams that smelled of old pine and dust. The second chamber? The passage led them into a chamber larger than the one beneath the library. At its center stood another contraption, this one more complete than the first. Gears mached together in careful order. A pendulum hung from an iron bracket, swinging faintly as though stirred by a breeze. And beside the machine stood a workbench. On it lay a set of tools, polished, well-kept, and recently used. A figure in the shadows. From the far corner came the scrape of a chair. Thomas froze, the lantern beam sweeping across the chamber. A man stepped into the light. His face was sharp, his eyes wary. And though he was older, the resemblance to Mr. Hatherley was unmistakable. "Man, so you've found it." I wondered how long it would take. The lantern's glow revealed Elias Hatherley in full. His shoulders were broad, though stooped with age, his coat patched and worn from years of use. His eyes sharp, restless, watched Thomas and Clarke with the guarded look of a man who had been living in the shadows far too long. The first words, Elias brushed dust from his sleeve, glancing at the unfinished contraption before them. "Elias, you shouldn't be here. These machines aren't toys for apprentices and inspectors. They're dangerous if you don't understand them." Thomas steadied his voice, though his heart beat fast. "Thomas, where is Mr. Hatherley? Why did he leave? And what are these chambers for?" Elias's gaze softened briefly at the mention of his brother, but then hardened again. "Elias, Alfred always wanted to build things greater than himself. But greatness comes with consequences. Consequences I'd spent years trying to contain." The tale of two brothers, by the dim lantern light, Elias told his story. The Hatherley brothers had been raised by a father who was both a craftsman and a dreamer. He believed clocks could be more than mere instruments of time. He taught his sons to see gears as keys, pendulums as bridges, and mechanisms as puzzles waiting to be solved. Alfred had inherited the dream. Elias had inherited the caution. When their father died, Alfred began building in secret, chambers beneath the library, the baker's cellar, and other sites across Bramblewick. He wanted to connect them, piece by piece, into a grand mechanism that spanned the town itself. Elias, he believed the machine could preserve knowledge, protect Bramblewick's history, and hide treasures until the world was ready. But he ignored the dangers, pressure, collapse, secrets buried too deep. So I left, or so people thought. Truth is, I stayed below to make sure Alfred didn't go too far. The rivalry of belief. Thomas struggled to understand. Thomas, if the machine was meant to protect, why stop him? Elias stepped closer, his face illuminated by the swaying lantern. Elias, because obsession blinds a man. Alfred no longer cared about the people of Bramblewick. He cared only about finishing the mechanism. And when a man forgets people for the sake of invention, he builds a prison instead of a legacy. The broken trust Clarke, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Clarke, so you dismantled it? Took pieces away to keep him from completing it? Elias nodded. Elias, every chamber holds part of the machine, but none of them work without the others. I scattered the pieces. It was the only way to keep him from finishing his dream. Or his madness. For centuries, St. Mary's bell tower had watched over Bramblewick. Its bells rang to mark weddings, festivals, and seasons of harvest. It was the tallest point in town, a landmark for travelers on the road, and a comfort to those who lived in its shadow. But now, guided by the red mark on Alfred Hatherley's map, Thomas and Inspector Clarke climbed its spiral staircase with the uneasy knowledge that the tower also hid part of the Clockmaker Secret. To climb, the stone steps wound tightly upward, their centers worn smooth by countless feet. Lantern light threw their shadows across the curved walls, the flicker making the stones seem alive. Halfway up, Thomas paused. He pressed his hand against the wall. Beneath the steady beat of his heart, he could swear he heard it again. The faint, impossible ticking. The belfry at last. They emerged into the belfry, where the great bronze bells hung motionless in the dim light. Ropes trailed down to the chamber below, and the air smelled faintly of dust and iron. It was silent, until Thomas's lantern caught the glint of something unusual. Behind one of the bells, set into the stone, was a brass panel. The hidden panel. Clarke brushed dust away. The panel bore a familiar symbol, a compass rose, identical to the one carved into Alfred's trunk. A small indentation marked its center, as though it awaited a key. Thomas thought of the brass clock, its hands frozen at 11:11, still resting in the shop below. Was it meant to open this? But before they could puzzle further, a low groan filled the chamber. The secret mechanism. The floor shifted. Gears hidden beneath the boards clicked, and one of the great bells trembled. It swung slightly, not from wind, but from something moving within the walls. Behind the ringing chamber, a section of stone slid aside, revealing a narrow passage leading deeper into the tower's heart. The tower's core inside, they found another chamber. This one was different from the others. Its machine was smaller, intricate, and complete. It resembled a miniature clock tower mechanism, gears interlocking with flawless precision. But it wasn't striking hours. Instead, its pendulum swung in perfect unison with the bells above, as though the entire tower itself was part of Alfred's great design. The town hall of Bramblewick was the pride of its people. With tall arched windows and a clock mounted in its tower, it served as the heart of the community, a place for markets, town meetings, and celebrations. But according to Alfred Hatherley's map, the hall was more than a gathering place. It was the final piece of a puzzle hidden beneath the streets of Bramblewick for generations. The empty hall. Night had fallen by the time Thomas and Inspector Clarke arrived. The square outside was quiet, lit only by lanterns swinging gently in the autumn wind. Inside, the hall stood empty, its wooden benches lined neatly in rows, its great clock ticking above the stage. Yet the silence carried weight, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The map's final mark. The red mark on Alfred's map indicated the very center of the hall. Thomas paced the floor, his boots echoing against the boards. He stopped at the precise spot, then knelt and pressed his hand against the floorboards. Hollow, Clarke produced a crowbar from his satchel. With a careful pull, he pried the boards loose. Beneath them lay a trapdoor, its iron handle rusted with age. The descent beneath the hall. The trapdoor opened onto a staircase of stone, spiraling downward into darkness. The air grew cooler, tinged with the scent of iron and damp earth. The lantern's glow flickered against the walls, revealing faint carvings, gears, stars, and the compass rose. At last, they stepped into a vast underground chamber. The grand mechanism, It was larger than any they had seen before. An enormous framework of gears. Wheels and pendulums filled the chamber. Iron rods stretched upward, connecting to the very clock that crowned the town hall. Pipes and shafts extended outward in 4 directions, no doubt linking the hall to the other chambers, the library, the bakery, and the bell tower. The entire town had been built around a single machine. The revelation Thomas felt his breath catch. He understood now. Alfred's vision had not been of separate inventions, but of a single unified mechanism, a hidden engine woven into the fabric of Bramblewick. But why? What purpose could it serve? Clarke turned slowly, his lantern sweeping across the chamber. On the far wall, carved deep into the stone, were words in Alfred Hatherley's hand. "Time will keep us safe." Deep beneath the town hall, Thomas and Inspector Clarke stood before the grand mechanism, the hidden heart of Bramblewick. Its gears shifted slowly, moving with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. It was a machine of memory, of preservation, a secret that only Alfred Hatherley had fully understood. And now it fell to Thomas to decide its future. The brothers' return. A shuffle of footsteps echoed through the chamber. From the shadows emerged Elias Hatherley once more, his lantern casting long beams across the iron framework. Elias, firmly. "So you've seen it all." This was Alfred's dream, to build a town that would never forget, a vault of time itself. But dreams can become burdens. The weight of memory can crush as surely as stone. Clarke stepped forward, his voice calm but steady. "Clarke, and yet you've kept watch all these years. You could have destroyed it, Elias, but you didn't. Why?" Elias's eyes softened. "Elias, because part of me believed he was right, that Bramblewick deserved to keep its past safe. But Alfred, he pushed too far. He thought the machine could do more than preserve, that it could protect us from change itself. And that is something no machine can do." The apprentice's choice Thomas stepped closer to the great machine. His hand brushed against the cool iron of a gear, its teeth worn smooth from decades of motion. He remembered Alfred's note, "When the clocks stop, follow the sound only you can hear." Perhaps it had not meant the sound of ticking. Perhaps it meant his own heartbeat, his own judgment. Thomas, quietly, "What do we do with it?" Elias watched him carefully. "Elias, that's not my choice anymore, nor Clarke's. It's yours. Alfred left the note for you. You are his apprentice. You carry his legacy." The decision, the chamber fell silent but for the hum of the gears. Thomas thought of the journals in the attic, the sketches, the care with which Alfred had built every timepiece. His master had not been a madman, nor a saint. He had been a man who wanted time to protect what he loved. Thomas turned to Clarke, then to Elias. "Thomas, we keep it, not to worship it, not to hide from the world, but to learn from it. If this machine preserves the past, then let it remind Bramblewick of who we were, so we never lose sight of who we are." The legacy Elias lowered his head, a faint smile crossing his weary face. "Elias, then perhaps Alfred chose well after all." Clarke placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Clarke, the town may never know what lies beneath its streets, but you will. And you'll make sure this legacy isn't forgotten, nor misused." As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the hall above, Thomas closed the trapdoor, sealing the chamber once more. The machine continued its steady rhythm, a heartbeat beneath the town, keeping time with lives lived above. The people of Bramblewick awoke that morning, unaware of the secret beneath their feet. The bells rang, the market opened, and the town lived on as it always had. But Thomas Hatherley, apprentice, guardian, and keeper of time, would never hear the tick of a clock the same way again. For he alone knew the truth, that time hides all truths, and some secrets are best kept safe within its rhythm.